Everybody, Jason Burmis here, and I gotta tell you, every single time I start taking a little bit harder of a look at this Epstein case, I find out more. I find out bigger and more horrifying details than before. And believe me, my mind runs amok with all the things that I don't know about and that the public doesn't know about and how horrible it could actually get. But one of the things we do here is we admit when we don't know something. We admit that there is knowledge out there that I'm not privy to. So what we're going to do is we're going to play these clips from a summit on misconduct from January of this year. I had no idea about this. It was put on by the Freedom Forum Initiative, I believe. You know, I'm not going to endorse these groups. I have no idea how legitimate they are. But they had the Miami Herald over, two separate reporters, the editor and the reporter, and them talking about the Epstein case in January. And I think this is extremely important because it's revealed during this that forget about the 36 victims we've talked about and continue to talk about. For instance, we did a video on Dershowitz yesterday. We mentioned that Catherine Clark had asked Acosta why it was he got this deal, talked about a minimum of 360 years that he should have been up against and was not. So that was in regards to the supposed 36 victims. And remember, earlier this year, we found out once the investigation had been reopened by the Department of Justice, many had assumed that his plea down was to the initial 14-year-old charge. In other words, the girl was 14, she made the charge. This would have put him as an offender in just about every state. However, instead of going with that one, they handpicked another girl who was 16 years of age, and that allowed him not to have to register as an offender in 30 plus states, 30 or 31, depending on what you believe in Wikipedia, as 16 would be the age of consent. And this is very important because the man owns properties everywhere throughout the states. And if you think it was just Florida and Little St. James Island, you haven't listened to Bradley Edwards, the lawyer who beat Epstein in court, or any of his victims. It goes far beyond that. So what we're going to do is we'll stop it periodically, but we're going to be breaking down this clip right here where the editor and the reporter break down this Epstein case and say that she tried to get 80 plus victims to speak to her and was able to speak to who? 60 of them. These are numbers I've never heard anywhere else. So I think it's very important. And many of these women never filed charges, never talked to anybody else. Extremely important information you're about to watch, folks.
I want to start with Mindy Marquez from the Miami Herald, and I want to make sure that you get credit for flying all the way in against all the travel issues that you might have faced. Talk to us about breaking the Epstein story and what it took. And we know that your star reporter is right here, and we're not going to let her escape attention.
So, in reality, Julie actually started looking at this case before the Me Too movement, actually became a movement. She had done incredible work on abuses at a women's correctional facility in Florida, and at the heart of that, a lot of it was about sexual traffic and sexual trade, and so she wanted to look at that as her next project. And every time she would Google, sex trafficking in Florida, well, the top of the name was Jeffrey Epstein.
So let's stop that right there. And that's an important point to make. I want to make that point, and I want to make that point clear. They're starting to talk about this and look at this as a new reporting series long after the fact, but before the Me Too movement. Now, Google is a tool everybody uses. And again, this case was so notorious that when you type in anything about trafficking, Florida, Epstein would be the first thing that came up. Well, we now live in a world where Google, Alphabet, whatever you want to call them, because that's their parent company, are curating content, are curating search results. We did a video on this channel showing you that Alex Jones, when you type that in, at least on my browser, it took 3 pages just to get to Infowars.com. That's a problem. That's burying the truth. That's burying media. That's burying search results. So we have to be less reliant on Google. But it also makes the point that will mainline journalists do that? I mean, the genesis of this story is a reporter looking on the internet to find out what is most egregious. So let's continue.
And the case was about 10 years old. And then then right at that moment, Acosta, who had handled that case, was actually nominated to be be in President Trump's cabinet. And we did a fairly quick turnaround story that highlighted how this story was this case was mishandled from the beginning. But Julie really felt there was more to do there. And I have to say, when Julie first came to talk to me about the story, this has been mined so deeply that I wasn't really sure. I said, Julie, what more can we really do here? Because so much has been written about this over, the last 10 years. And Julie said very emphatically, nobody's ever talked to the victims.
Nobody's ever talked to the victims. So now we're talking about a case that was 10 plus years old, that had the who's who of names with Hollywood and political connections, and they never talked to the victims. You think those victims might have had something to say? You bet they would have. And believe me, I'm extremely happy with the work that the Miami Herald has done in the last couple years, 2-3 years really, on this case, and I've been following it extremely closely. But we're going to get into more details when they get to the actual reporter. But thank God she listened to her reporter and she actually decided that this was something worthy to cover, because without the Miami Herald doing this work, would we really have any coverage whatsoever in the quote-unquote mainstream, the Fox Newses, the MSNBCs, the CNNs of the world that already barely cover this? Luckily, I'm not a huge fan of the Daily Beast, but they've done a lot of great work on the heels of the Miami Herald, a lot of their own stuff now. But without the Miami Herald, does that even happen? I don't think so.
Nobody's talked to them. Nobody's heard from them. They were shut out of this process, and we've never gone back. And the work that she did to find out who those now women, but really young, teenagers, some of them still wearing braces, were, and to compile a name of 60 women was really extraordinary. And she was able to reach out to about 60 of 80 ultimately victims that were identified. And again,
60 of 80 victims identified. First time I've ever heard it. First time I've ever heard of 80 victims identified. What does that mean? Well, since there's only 36 cases that I know of in court where these women that were interviewed and contacted at the behest of other victims that simply did not want to involve themselves, did not want to go through the ridicule, did not want to go through the court process because they had an idea of what was going to happen, how powerful this man actually was.
Get more than half a dozen to talk to us. So, and then she was doing all this work, and then the Me Too, Me Too movement broke out with this extraordinary reporting that fall. But we were able to really, I think, coming at it from the perspective of what is the story of the victims that nobody's ever heard, gave this such a different perspective, and also how did this go so wrong, and how was this able to happen? Which, again, so much had been written, but I think nobody took that 30,000 foot, and plus Julie brought tons of new material to bear by digging and digging and digging.
Well, since I have Julie, who's next to Julie Brown, let's ask two things. One, this is also a story about power. There's no question, and triggered, of course, by someone's nomination, to a higher position in government, but also the conversation with victims. So we want your wisdom, not just how you did it, but what advice you have for all the journalists who are paying attention, who want to look at systemic power abuses and also want to find a way to talk with victims that doesn't cause harm in the process.
Well, you have to gain their trust. You don't do it overnight. I mean,
Now let's stop. I don't think that there's any way not to cause harm again in the process. You're going to go over some really traumatic things. But I think that harmful information, that life experience, isn't going away without some kind of closure anyway. It may never go away. But as somebody who's never been a victim of that kind of a traumatic attack, I can't speak for these people, but I know in my heart of hearts when I am wronged, I want that person to have justice brought upon them. I want people to listen to my plight. Now, I never want to play the victim, but remember, these were child victims. These were kids. These were teenagers. Some of them very young, very influenced by money and power. And remember, none of them went in there thinking that this was some kind of a trafficking operation. They all thought they were going to give an old man a massage for a bunch of money. And then they have this pretty woman next to him, Ghislaine Maxwell, with all these other connections. His right-hand lady, and she's helping him out, and she's describing what to do. And this is a pretty woman. Why not get involved? So let's continue.
I mean, that's part of the reason why this project took so long. There were a lot of people I went to initially that didn't want to talk at all. They never, a lot of these women never told anybody that they were. This was, for those who don't know, this was a multimillionaire hedge fund manager from New York who owned homes all over the world, really, and he owns a home in Palm Beach. And for years he had been molesting very young girls. And the police found out about it. He had the means to hire some of the most powerful well-known lawyers in the world, Alan Dershowitz, Kenneth Starr, Roy Black, and he managed to use his money and his power to manipulate the criminal justice system. And that's another whole part of the story is how he did that, which he essentially got the prosecutors, among them the state attorney and the U.S. attorney Alex Acosta, who is now the Secretary of Labor, to essentially work with his attorneys hand in hand to conceal the scope of this man's crimes.
Let's stop it there. Conceal the man's crimes. The scope of his crimes. Hand in hand with people like Dershowitz, who has his own court battles going on. We just covered that yesterday involving this case. People like Kenneth Starr, old Whitewater star, old and peachy Clinton star, heavily involved. In fact, James Bamford, the author of Filthy Rich, remember, James Bamford is the most prolific and famous author in the country, if not the world. He has superseded the sales of even Stephen King with his fictional novels. Everybody basically ignored the fact that he wrote a nonfiction novel on Jeffrey Epstein, has been to plenty of these court hearings, and he thinks Starr is a huge player in this. Now, remember Acosta, now the labor secretary. At the time, he was the one making this sweetheart deal. Trump has huge connections in Florida. Again, Bamford reports that he broke it off with Epstein. In other words, they did have a relationship when he found out that one of his acquaintances' daughters had been pimped out by Epstein through Mar-a-Lago. That's where the falling out happened. Before that, yeah, they were riding on each other's planes. Get over it. I know that's tough for some people to believe, but yes, Melania, Ghislaine, Epstein, and Trump all knew each other, all took pictures together, all traveled with one another. These are facts. Now, hopefully when he found out what was really going on, that's what the breakup was. But nobody wants to talk about these connections and this stuff. And now we're finding out, no, it wasn't 36 victims. It was more around 80 that the Miami Herald found. This is unbelievable stuff, and it's not being reported anywhere else. I'm so glad I came across this.
Were not victims. They were essentially treated as prostitutes because the whole way he lured them, they were poor girls who came from very troubled families, had no money, and he said, you know, the lure that he used was just come give an old man essentially a massage, and you know, it wasn't a massage at all. So, but somehow he and his attorneys managed to convince the prosecutors that these weren't victims, they were prostitutes, they were child prostitutes. And so these girls, when I first approached them, did not want to talk to me, because even though there had been tons of media coverage about this story, it had been, in their minds, it had been covered from a sensationalized point of view, where all anybody really wanted to read was, you know, sex, and these were famous people, and Clinton was on his plane, Epstein's plane, and in their point of view, and also in the point of view of the police chief, who had never been interviewed before, and the lead detective, no one really wanted to look at exactly what went wrong. And
What went wrong? So let's talk a little bit. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. It doesn't exist. That's a fallacy. He abused children. No such thing. It's not a term. It's not a reality, okay? And I was just given a super chat by Port Film Co-op. Thank you so much. We answer super chats here. And he's asking, is Alex Jones right about the elite occult abuse? And I guess that really depends on which Alex Jones we're talking about and what abuse we're talking about. For instance, if we're talking about Epstein, right? On his island, he had this very odd temple built, and I've done past videos on it. It's since been bulldozed, but it was very Egyptian looking. It had, it definitely had, you know, certain figures of, you could say, the occult on the outside. So in that respect, yeah, it seems like that is real. On a larger scale, in July, we'll have the Bohemian Grove, and that kicks off with a occultic ritual with a giant owl. It's hollowed out. They've got the orchestra there, and they make a mock human sacrifice to dull care, saying that, hey, we're going to work with one another, and anything we're doing that may be a little bit negative on this end, we're going to wash away those sins. Now, there's a lot of other stuff out there I've reported on. You can watch it in Invisible Empire, for instance. But to me, the problem is it's not a left issue. I keep hearing these hardcore leftists are into the occult. Used to not be that way. It's both sides. I want to let you know it has nothing to do with the left or right, conservative or liberal. It seems in upper echelons of society, of politics, of business, you do have a certain class of people that absolutely are into the occult. But guys, I think I'm going to wrap this one up. I want to go over the highlights once again. We found out that the Miami Herald, again, not 20 victims, not 30 victims, not 40 victims, not 50 victims. They talked to 60 plus victims out of 80 plus, because those ones did not want to talk. Many never even filed charges. Let that sink in. And I can only hope that justice is done in this latest purge of the Epstein information. I don't know that it's going to happen. Acosta's on the inside. Barr has already recused himself of everything Epstein, as he worked for one of the law firms that defended him in the initial case. So we're going to keep an eye on this. If you haven't joined the Burmese Brigade, now's the time to hit that subscribe button. Share this all over social media, because I'm sure it's been demonetized by now, which is going to limit its reach. Just about everything I do, Epstein or Dershowitz related, yeah, it doesn't make it, guys. So I'm not going to stop reporting on this because it's important information, and I'm not seeing it expounded upon in the mainstream media. I need your support. You guys have to share it. Thank you so much. I will see everybody on the flip side.